So I'm out with Ivy today and we are going to be looking at a retrieving exercise. So I recently got to watch some friends doing their grade 5 Gundog Club test for the hunting retriever, so the Spaniel category. And there was one particular exercise in it which seemed really hard. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to break down that exercise into some easier layers and then see if we can start to work up towards the standard that we'd need if and when we were going to do the grade 5. Now that is a way off for us, so I'm not expecting to get to the final result in today's session by any means, but we are going to give it a go and see how we get on. So the exercise in the grade 5 is that shot is fired and a marked retrieve is thrown, and then you have to line and send your dog for a blind retrieve. And in the setup from the test that I watched, it was a really tight angle. It was probably about 45 degrees, if not a bit tighter, and the dog was on the handler's left hand side where the mark was, and you were lining them to a blind towards your right, so it's not even like you had a physical body barrier to help. So it was really tough, which means we definitely wouldn't have been able to achieve it at the standard we're at now, but it's something that we can aim to and work towards. So I shall give this session a go and see how she gets on. So I'm starting off by setting up an easy version of the exercise. So here I'm about to plop the blind down as Ivy's sprinting away from me while she's just having a bit of a runabout. And then once that's down, I'm going to walk out to where our starting position is going to be, and I'm going to throw the marked retrieve out. I'm going to throw it so it's 180 degrees away from the blind. So there's going to be a real clear distinction between where the mark landed and where I'm lining her to. So hopefully this should set her up for success to start the session. So she watches me throw the mark out, and then I turn her around and I line and send her towards the blind. And now in this field there are some areas of kind of longer tufts of grass, and so throughout this session I'm using them as my markers to hide the blind, but they're also giving Ivy a bit of a visual target to aim to when I'm lining her out. And you can see there she ran out beautifully, she found the dummy, picked it and brought it back. So couldn't ask for any more from that version. So then I go and pick up the marked retrieve, and then we set up a different exercise in a different location in this field, just making the angles a little bit harder this time. So in this exercise I'm going to throw the mark out so it's a 90-degree angle away from the blind. And I'm also doing it so I'm throwing the mark out towards my left side, and that's the same side that I have Ivy on. So just I guess something to consider when setting this up. I personally think it's harder if the mark is on the same side as the dog, because you've not got that physical barrier of yourself between the dog and the mark. So that's a factor that you can play about with when you're setting up these exercises. But then I set her up, focus her on the line, and then send her with my verbal cue. And again you can see the little kind of tufts of grass area where I've hidden them, and again she finds it beautifully and brings it back. So that worked really nicely, although she stumbled on her way home. And I guess something else to note with this session is I chose to use white dummies to help with this. So as we're still building Ivy's confidence up with this exercise, and I didn't want it to turn into a handling exercise, the white dummies help because they're very visual, so she's able to see them very clearly on the grass. So as soon as she's following that line, she can kind of clock on to the dummy quite quickly, which means she gets more success, and again that helps build her confidence with this. If you wanted to make it more challenging, you could use green dummies, red dummies, that the dog finds more visually challenging to see in the grass. So that's another factor that you can play about with these sorts of sessions. So then we moved to a different part of the field, and I set up the final repetition that we did of this exercise during this session. And I guess it's worth noting the reason that I'm moving to different locations in the field for each of these repetitions is because for Ivy at this stage I want each blind to be a true blind. So if I had used the same spot or the same tuft of grass to hide each blind, it would become more of a memory exercise for her, which is fine. And if your dog's struggling with this, that might be a way to help them get more success, to use a location where they are reliably finding retrieves. But for this, I was trying to kind of test Ivy a little bit more, and so that's why I'm using new locations for the blind each time. So this time you'll see I sit her up and I throw the mark out to about a 45-degree angle, and this is probably about the angle that they worked at with the grade 5 test that I watched, although the terrain was more challenging and the distances were slightly larger. So there's still elements that we need to work up to here, but I threw that out and then I line and send her towards the tuft of grass with the blind in. Again, she gets success with this, which is really nice. And you'll have heard with each of the repetitions, as she gets into the right area, I'm blowing my hunt whistle. So that's just to kind of tell her you're in the right spot, start looking. And my thought process behind that in this session was that I didn't want it to turn into a handling exercise, and I didn't want it to turn into a stop whistle exercise. And her stop whistle still isn't the best. And I felt like if I was putting a stop on and it was going wrong, then it would kind of take away from actually what I was wanting to practice in this session, which was lining towards a blind, following that line whilst ignoring the mark. So that's why I chose not to use a stop in this session. You could, however, choose to stop your dog when they're in the right area and then give them the hunt whistle to get their nose down if needed. So again, some options that you can play about with depending on your dog, what you're focusing on with your training and the level that you're at. I then finished this session by allowing her to go and retrieve the mark, so just again lining and sending her for that, and she did a nice job of that. So a nice way to end that session for her. So that session went brilliantly. I'm really pleased with it. But what I thought I'd do is I'd also include some clips from the session I did with her the week before I filmed this. Because I filmed similar exercises that we were doing, but we had some errors, so I thought it'd be nice to show you what those errors were and how I dealt with them. So I've thrown my marked retrieve out and I return to Ivy and I line her towards the blind area, and you'll see that on the first attempt her head is very much showing me that she wants to go to the mark. So I just get up and I reset, and she looks like she was committed to my line. But you can tell there that as I sent her for it, she went towards the mark. So all I did is I recalled her back. I was really pleased with that recall off of a retrieve, so I reward her for the recall. And then what I did is I tried to line and send her again for the blind, and I thought she was committed to it there, so I sent her, but again she got it wrong. So this is clearly her telling me that I've set this up a little bit too hard for her for this day. So what I do is I reset the exercise again. So I throw the mark out and I kept the angle pretty much the same, but an adjustment I could have made to the exercise is that I could have made the angle easier. So I could have thrown that at more of a 90-degree angle from the blind if I wanted and kept the distances the same. However, what I chose to do in this session was keep the angle the same, and I walked her closer towards the blind retrieve. So I'm shortening the distance of the blind retrieve for her. And that worked in this session. You'll see that I line and send her and she runs out the correct line this time, picks it and brings it back. And so that was the adjustment we made in this session to get success. But as I say, you could play about with the angles to make it easier instead if you wanted to. But I thought that'd just be interesting to show. We don't always get it right. We do make errors. And that's just how I dealt with them in this scenario. So hopefully that's been interesting. I think for us, our next stage will be either to progress this similar sort of setup into a more interesting environment, so moving it into the woods, or I might look at making the setups a bit easier and introducing the shot element. So I'll have a think about that, and if I can, I will try and film one of those sessions for you. But as always, if you have any tips, any advice or any questions, please feel free to pop them in the comments below.